Avoidant attachment is one of the most misunderstood attachment styles because, from the outside, it tends to look like strength. People with avoidant attachment are often self-sufficient, competent, capable of being alone, and not obviously distressed in the ways that anxious attachment is. But the self-sufficiency of avoidant attachment is not the same as security. It is a form of management, keeping emotional needs at a distance, limiting vulnerability, and maintaining independence in ways that protect against the risk of disappointment or engulfment, but also limit genuine intimacy. How to heal avoidant attachment style requires understanding what the pattern actually is, what it protected against in its original context, and what the specific work of moving toward greater security involves. Avoidant attachment develops, like anxious attachment, from early relational experiences, but the specific feature is different. Where anxious attachment typically develops from inconsistent and unpredictable caregiving, avoidant attachment typically develops from caregiving that was consistently emotionally distant, dismissive of emotional needs, or that punished or ignored displays of distress. Phil Shaver at the University of California, Davis, building on the foundational work of John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth, showed that infants whose emotional bids are consistently met with dismissal or withdrawal develop a deactivating strategy. They learn to suppress awareness of emotional needs and attachment signals to avoid the experience of reaching out and being turned away. Christopher Fraley at the University of Illinois, whose longitudinal research on attachment patterns showed remarkable stability across the lifespan, found that this deactivating strategy becomes so habitual that the person stops being fully aware of having suppressed the need. The protection works, but at the cost of the emotional life it was protecting. The specific patterns that avoidant attachment produces in adult relationships are worth naming specifically because they are often invisible from the inside. Shaver and his colleagues identified what they called deactivating strategies, the tendency to idealize independence while devaluing the importance of close relationships, the practice of noting a partner's flaws when closeness becomes threatening, physical or emotional withdrawal when the relationship deepens or the partner expresses need. And a preference for emotional distance in the form of self-reliance combined with an aversion to depending on or being depended upon. Mario Mikulincer at Bar-Ilan University, whose extensive research on avoidant attachment has been influential, showed that under conditions of acute stress, avoidant attached adults show a paradoxical pattern. Their self-reports suggest they are fine, but their physiological indicators, including elevated cortisol, show that the stress is very much present. The suppression is real. The stress is also real. They simply coexist, with the suppression preventing the stress from being processed or expressed. Emotional bypassing, the tendency to process experiences cognitively rather than feeling them somatically, is a characteristic feature of avoidant attachment. Daniel Siegel at UCLA, whose interpersonal neurobiology framework illuminated how early relationships shape the neural integration of emotional experience, showed that dismissive caregiving impairs the development of the neural circuits that integrate bodily feelings, emotional responses, and cognitive meaning. The result is a tendency to intellectualize feelings, to understand what you feel without fully experiencing it in the body, and to find emotional conversations either confusing or threatening in a way that is difficult to articulate. Peter Levine's somatic experiencing work showed that emotional experience that is consistently bypassed does not disappear, but is stored at the level of the body as unresolved physiological tension. The healing from avoidant attachment requires, in part, learning to go back down into the body and recovering the capacity to feel what is felt rather than only to understand it. One of the most significant relational costs of avoidant attachment is the misreading of a partner's bids for connection. John Gottman at the University of Washington, whose research identified bids for connection as the fundamental unit of relational bonding, showed that healthy relationship maintenance depends on recognizing and responding to the partner's attempts to create connection, however small and informal those attempts might be. For the avoidantly attached, these bids are often misread. A partner's expression of need is experienced as a demand for more than is comfortable to give. A protest behavior is experienced as manipulation or control rather than as an attachment signal, and the appropriate response to move toward rather than away from the partner is instead to withdraw. This misreading is not a failure of care. It is a perceptual pattern shaped by early experience in which another person's need for closeness was associated with something threatening rather than with something that invites a response. The loneliness of avoidant attachment is one of its most painful and least discussed features. John Cacioppo at the University of Chicago, whose foundational research on loneliness showed it to be one of the most significant threats to health and well-being, found that the subjective experience of loneliness is not simply the absence of social contact, but the absence of genuine emotional connection. Many avoidantly attached people have social contact. They have friends, colleagues, and partners. What is often absent is the experience of being truly known, of being close in the way that requires lowering the defensive barriers. The suppression that protects against the risk of need going unmet also prevents the experience of need being met, which means the loneliness that avoidance was developed to manage often persists even in the presence of relationships. There is actually a quiet, beautiful 3D game called Inner Phoenix built around navigating exactly these kinds of difficult emotional phases. A digital sanctuary designed for moments of healing, but more on that in a moment. Gradual vulnerability practice is the primary mechanism of avoidant attachment healing, and it works through the same principle as systematic desensitization, graduated exposure to what the nervous system has learned to avoid, paired with regulation so that the exposure does not overwhelm. Joseph Wolpe, whose systematic desensitization work showed how gradual exposure produces new learning that competes with the old fear association, provided the framework. Stephen Hayes at the University of Nevada, Reno, whose acceptance and commitment therapy showed how the willingness to experience discomfort in the service of valued action produces genuine change, found that the practice of small and deliberate steps toward emotional sharing creates new evidence for the nervous system. Vulnerability in thea. Each context was not met with dismissal. Dependence in this context was not punished. Each small experience of having a need or feeling received with care provides the nervous system with the corrective information it needs to begin updating the old pattern. Somatic awareness development is central to avoidant attachment healing because the deactivating strategy operates at the level of the body. The suppression happens physiologically, not just cognitively. Peter Levine's somatic experiencing approach provides specific practices for developing the capacity to notice bodily sensations without immediately moving to cognitive processing. The tightening in the chest when closeness increases, the urge to create distance that arrives as a physical sensation before it is a thought. Stephen Porges at Indiana University, whose polyvagal theory mapped the physiological states associated with social engagement and defense, showed that the ventral vagal system, which supports genuine connection and emotional engagement, can be cultivated through specific bodily practices. Extended exhales, physical warmth, gentle movement, and contact with nature all activate this system. For avoidant attachment, these practices are about developing access to the physiological state in which genuine connection is possible, not just about relaxation. Cognitive restructuring of the beliefs about dependence and independence is a necessary part of avoidant attachment healing. Aaron Beck at the University of Pennsylvania, whose cognitive behavioral therapy identified the role of core beliefs in maintaining attachment patterns, found that avoidant attachment is often associated with beliefs like depending on others is weakness, my needs will not be met if I express them, and I am more competent if I handle everything alone. These beliefs were formed from real experiences, and they have a certain internal consistency. The work is not to dismiss them, but to examine them. What evidence actually supports these beliefs, and what evidence contradicts them? In what domains is dependence genuinely harmful? And in what domains does it simply feel threatening in ways that early experience established? Distinguishing between the conditioned fear of dependence and the evidence-based assessment of when dependence is actually costly allows for a more nuanced and accurate relationship with closeness. Building an internal secure base is as relevant for avoidant as for anxious attachment, though the work looks somewhat different. Krista Neff at the University of Texas, Austin, whose research on self-compassion showed the importance of an internal relationship with the self that is warm, consistent, and supportive, found that people who have access to genuine self-compassion are less threatened by interpersonal vulnerability because they have an internal source of support that does not depend on the other person responding perfectly. For the avoidantly attached, this matters because one of the functions of independence is to not need anyone else in ways that might disappoint. A genuine internal secure base means that even if a vulnerability is not met perfectly by the other person, you can metabolize that without it confirming the original belief that needs are dangerous to express. The self-compassion is not a replacement for relational warmth. It is what makes it possible to risk relational warmth without the whole sense of self being at stake in the outcome. Learning to recognize and respond to a partner's bids for connection is a practical and essential skill. Gottman's research on bids for connection showed that these bids can be as small as a comment about the weather or as significant as a disclosure of fear, and that turning toward them, even briefly and imperfectly, is one of the most reliable predictors of relationship quality over time. For the avoidantly attached person, learning to recognize a bid when it arrives, this is the partner seeking connection rather than demanding something threatening, and to practice turning toward it even when the impulse is to withdraw is one of the most direct forms of healing available. It does not require a major therapeutic breakthrough. It requires catching the moment, recognizing it as a bid, and choosing a response that moves toward rather than away. Repeated over time, this practice fundamentally changes the relational dynamic and provides the partner with evidence that their needs are legible and welcome. If working on your attachment patterns is something you are actively doing, consider subscribing. This channel covers attachment, regulation, and relationship neuroscience consistently and in depth. Mindfulness practice supports avoidant attachment healing by training the capacity to observe the deactivating impulse without automatically following it. John Kabat-Zinn at the University of Massachusetts Medical School, whose mindfulness-based stress reduction program has been extensively researched, showed that the practice of observing thoughts, feelings, and urges as events in awareness rather than as commands significantly reduces emotional reactivity over time. For avoidant attachment, this means learning to notice the impulse to withdraw, the irritation that appears when a partner expresses a need, the urge to find flaws, and to observe these as signals of the protective system activating rather than as accurate assessments of the present moment. Creating a brief pause between the activation and the response is where the possibility of a different choice lives. Mindfulness also helps with the emotional bypassing by training attention toward the bodily experience that avoidance tends to bypass. Grief is a necessary and often unexpected part of avoidant attachment healing. What is being grieved is the childhood loss, the caregiving that was not available in the form that was needed, the emotional needs that were not met, the self that was developed in response to an emotional environment that required suppression rather than expression. Judith Herman at Harvard Medical School, whose work on complex trauma showed grief as a central element of recovery from chronic early relational experience, found that healing does not proceed fully until the losses that shape the protective strategy are acknowledged and mourned. For avoidantly attached people, this grief can be particularly complicated because the early environment often did not include overt harm. The caregivers may have been competent in practical ways and not malicious. The grief is for what was absent rather than for what was done, and grief for absence can be more difficult to claim as real than grief for what was actively taken. Expressive writing is particularly useful for avoidant attachment healing because writing requires a slowing down that the bypassing strategy typically avoids. James Pennebaker at the University of Texas, Austin, whose research consistently showed that writing about emotional experiences produces improvements in processing and well-being, found that the act of putting feelings into words creates a kind of integration between cognitive and emotional processing that is exactly what avoidant attachment and tends to separate. For the avoidantly attached person who thinks about emotions without fully feeling them, writing can be the bridge. When you write, "I felt scared when the conversation turned serious," the body that experienced the fear is engaged in the process in a way that purely cognitive processing does not require. Starting with brief writing, 5 to 10 minutes, about specific relational moments and the actual bodily experience that accompanied them, builds the integrative capacity that avoidant attachment healing requires. Professional support for avoidant attachment offers the specific experience of a relationship that is both warm and appropriately boundaried, which is itself a corrective experience for the early caregiving that often left those lines blurred. Sue Johnson at the University of Ottawa, who developed emotionally focused therapy specifically around attachment theory, showed that EFT directly targets the cycles that attachment patterns produce in relationships and helps each partner understand the other's behavior in terms of the underlying attachment needs rather than in terms of CA character. For the avoidantly attached person in an individual therapy context, The consistent and reliably present therapeutic relationship provides the gradual corrective experience that helps the nervous system learn that dependence on another person does not require suppressing yourself. If the thought, "I don't need help with this," has been present, it may be worth noticing that the thought itself may be part of the very pattern being examined. Sleep and physical health matter in avoidant attachment healing for the same reason they matter in all nervous system work. The quality of the physiological state determines the capacity for the emotional regulation and vulnerability that the healing requires. Matthew Walker at the University of California, Berkeley showed that adequate deep sleep restores vagal tone and reduces the amygdala's threat reactivity, which means that a well-rested nervous system is significantly more capable of tolerating the openness that avoidant attachment healing asks for than a sleep-deprived one. Janice Kiecolt-Glasser at Ohio State University documented that interpersonal stress produces measurable physiological consequences, including elevated inflammation and impaired immune function, which compound the stress of the relational work. Attending to sleep, movement, and regular nutrition is not separate from the attachment work. It is the physiological substrate on which that work happens. Low-stakes social connection is a useful training ground for avoidant attachment healing because it provides opportunities to practice emotional engagement without the high stakes of the primary romantic relationship. Cacioppo's research showed that even brief positive social interactions provide the nervous system with small accumulations of evidence that connection is safe. For the avoidantly attached person, building in regular low-stakes social experiences that involve some genuine emotional exchange, not overwhelming disclosure, but authentic presence, gradually expands the window of what is tolerable in terms of interpersonal closeness. Each experience of connection that does not produce the feared consequence of engulfment or loss of self provides the nervous system with another data point against the pattern that closeness is dangerous. Post-traumatic growth through avoidant attachment healing is genuinely possible, and it tends to take a particular form for this style. Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte, who developed the research base on post-traumatic growth, found that people who engage honestly with their difficult relational patterns often report an increased appreciation for genuine connection, specifically because they understand what it costs to avoid it and what it feels like when the barriers begin to come down. Many people who have done significant work on avoidant attachment describe the experience of genuine intimacy, arrived at through the deliberate practice described here, as qualitatively different from anything they had before. Not less free, but actually freer, because the energy that was going into management and suppression is no longer are required. What would you say to someone who is at the beginning of this work, uncertain whether it is worth the effort? Leave a comment, because those words reach people who need to hear them. The timeline of avoidant attachment healing is long and requires patience with the pace. These patterns were laid down early and reinforced through decades of use. They do not dissolve through insight alone, however accurate and illuminating the insight might be. Michael Merzenich at the University of California, San Francisco, whose neuroplasticity research showed the brain's genuine capacity for reorganization through experience, found that the change happens through the gradual accumulation of new relational experiences, not through understanding alone. The understanding creates the intention. The new relational experiences create the new neural patterns. Both are necessary. There will be periods when the old pattern feels completely intact despite the work. There will also be moments, sometimes surprising in their arrival, when something is different. A vulnerability expressed without the usual retraction, a partner's need met with genuine warmth, a moment of closeness that does not produce the familiar impulse to withdraw. These moments are evidence that the work is real. The longer view of avoidant attachment healing is this: earned security, the genuine shift toward a more secure relational style through deliberate work and corrective experience, is real and documented. Phil Shaver's longitudinal research showed that people do move along the attachment dimension over time, and that the movement is more common in people who have intentional relationships and do intentional work. The goal is not to become someone who has no preference for autonomy or who is suddenly comfortable with unlimited closeness. The goal is to have closeness available as a choice rather than as something the nervous system prevents. To be able to choose connection from a place of genuine capacity rather than to be prevented from it by a protective strategy that no longer serves the life being lived. That choice and the freedom it represents is what all of this work is for. And before you go, there is a 3D game called Inner Phoenix. You walk through it like a quiet sanctuary, with rooms for observing what you are feeling, naming what you need, and finding stillness in the middle of the work you are doing. You can scan the QR code at the end of this video to visit, or find it in the description at innerphoenix.app. It was made for exactly these moments of ongoing attachment work that need somewhere quiet to be held. No pressure. Whenever you feel ready, it will be there.